A whole bunch of surprises are revealed that shows Lenovo planning to treat Linux like a first-class citizen. Stuff like a Linux equivalent to Lenovo Vantage. Stuff like global availability and shipping. Lenovo announces that it will certify its ThinkStation PCs and ThinkPad P-Series laptops for both Ubuntu LTS and Red Hat Enterprise Linux.
Lenovo says all of its ThinkStation and ThinkPad P-Series laptops will be available to buy with Ubuntu.
Bill Gates is erupting right now because Lenovo just did the one thing Microsoft thought would never happen. The world's largest PC manufacturer looked at Windows and said, "No thanks." Lenovo announced that starting Q2 2025, Linux will be the default operating system on up to 60% of its consumer laptops. Windows is no longer automatic. It is now a paid add-on. Imagine that. After 30 years of dominance, Windows gets demoted.
And then they really blew things out of the water by saying, okay, now we're going to put Ubuntu LTS and Red Hat Enterprise Linux on pretty much every workstation PC that we have, and we're going to have web support, and we're going to have a new forum, and we're going to be building software so that you get, that equivalent experience on Linux that you would on Windows.
Think about what that means. For decades, if you bought a non-Apple computer, Windows came pre-installed. You did not choose it. It was just there. That default position built Microsoft's empire. Now Lenovo is telling customers they can buy the machine without Windows and save money. If Windows is such a masterpiece, why does it need to be bundled in the dark instead of chosen in the light?
Every single workstation PC they sell won't just support the distros, they'll ship with them pre-installed.
Lenovo did not stop at consumer laptops. They certified their ThinkPad P-Series and ThinkStation workstations for Ubuntu LTS and Red Hat Enterprise Linux. These are professional machines used by engineers, developers, and designers. This is not a hobby move. This is a strategic shift. And Microsoft reportedly offered a 40% discount on Windows licenses to slow it down. That alone tells you something. If your product is strong, you do not need emergency discounts.
More and more people are ditching Windows and shifting to Linux, not just tech enthusiasts, but regular users, organizations, and even governments.
Let's talk about the money, because that is where this gets embarrassing for Microsoft. Windows OEM licenses cost between $50 and $80 per device. The average is around $65. On a $400 laptop, that is up to 20% of the retail price before Lenovo even makes profit. That is not a small fee. That is a massive cut for software that now includes ads and forced updates.
But moving to Linux doesn't cost you anything, makes you safer, and allows you to use even old computers. Win, win, win.
It gets worse. Windows 11 brought hardware requirements that forced manufacturers to increase costs. TPM 2.0 chips added $3 to $5 per device. The minimum RAM effectively became 8 gigabytes, adding another $12 to $15. Certain CPUs were blacklisted. Lenovo paid for all of that. Microsoft wrote the rules, but the hardware companies paid the bill. How is that a partnership? That sounds more like a landlord squeezing tenants.
Lenovo is already well represented within the Linux hardware community, having certified a swath of its devices for various different distros over the years.
Reports show Lenovo was losing around $47 per laptop just dealing with Windows-related complaints and returns. That is not the license fee. That is on top of it. Returns, support calls, update failures, frustrated customers. Every time Windows breaks something, Lenovo's support center answers the phone. Microsoft collects license money and moves on. You tell me who is carrying the burden here.
I was all aboard that Lenovo hype train. They did a fantastic job of getting us excited about Linux being treated as a first-class citizen. They had the big announcement alongside Fedora where they were going to release 3 different laptops globally.
Now let's address Windows 11 itself. Adoption has stalled at around 54%, even after 4 years. Compare that to Windows 10. which spread much faster. Why the slowdown? Because Windows 11 locked out millions of perfectly working PCs. TPM 2.0 became mandatory. Older CPUs became unsupported. People with functional machines were told to buy new hardware. That does not feel like innovation. That feels like forced spending.
Let's be real about something. Objectively speaking, Windows 11 sucks. It's slower than Windows 10, still comes with pre-installed apps that you don't need, and even more with updates, insists on you creating a Microsoft account and syncing your stuff to their cloud storage OneDrive.
Windows 10 support ended in October 2025, so millions of users were pushed into a corner. Upgrade your hardware or run an unsupported system. Meanwhile, Linux runs smoothly on older machines. You can install Ubuntu, Mint, or Fedora on a 6 or 7-year-old laptop and it works. No forced chip requirement, no artificial blacklist. Which option sounds more respectful of users?
And the company recently revealed plans to sell laptops preloaded with Fedora and make more firmware updates available through the vendor-neutral Linux vendor firmware service. But now it's going even further with the Linux Love.
Then there are the ads. Yes, ads inside a paid operating system. Start menu suggestions, promotional tiles, cloud storage prompts. Microsoft introduced features like Recall that periodically takes screenshots for AI indexing. People did not ask for that. They bought a computer, not a surveillance assistant. Why does a desktop operating system need to behave like a social media platform? Windows 11 also pushes full-screen upgrade prompts and update screens at inconvenient times. You cannot simply say no. Updates restart your machine, sometimes in the middle of work. This is supposed to be a professional tool. Why does it behave like it owns the user instead of serving the user? When did Microsoft decide that control belongs to them?
Linux is also built in a more modular manner than Windows. This means Linux applications tend to not mess with the operating system's kernel as much or with other programs.
Now look at Linux. Global desktop market share hit 11.4%, up from 3.1% just 3 years ago. That is a 268% increase. That is not random noise, that is acceleration. And 87% of new Linux users came directly from Windows, not from Mac, not from Chrome OS. From Windows. This is not Apple stealing market share. This is people choosing free, open software over Microsoft. Projections suggest Linux could hit 18% to 22% by the end of 2026. If that happens, developers will no longer ignore Linux. Hardware vendors will optimize for it. The so-called joke about the year of Linux desktop stops being a joke. And Lenovo moving 60% of its lineup to Linux makes that shift even more real.
Linux is highly customizable. You can see this in how everything from servers to Android phones to smart thermostats use versions of Linux. But what does that mean for you, the home user? It means that you have real choices as to what you want your Linux experience to look and feel like. Lots of folks think that you need to be a programmer or a system admin who's intimately familiar with the command line in order to use Linux.
You also cannot ignore gaming. Steam Linux share climbed from 1.4% in early 2023 to 9.3% in late 2025. That is nearly 1 in 10 Steam users on Linux. Valve's Steam Deck sold over 6 million units by mid-2025, all running Linux. Proton compatibility allows 12,400 games to run on Linux. Some benchmarks even show up to 19% higher frame rates compared to Windows 11. For years, Microsoft claimed gaming would lock users into Windows. That wall is cracking. Lenovo saw these numbers. They saw the support costs. They saw the frustration. And they chose Linux. Not because it is trendy, but because it makes economic sense. No license fee, no forced hardware inflation, no ad engine built into the operating system, just software that runs the machine.
Starting, of course, with freedom. When you install Linux, you can take a deep, calm breath, knowing that your private data isn't being sent off to some Microsoft server.
Now let's talk about the part Microsoft never expected to lose control over: gaming. For decades, Windows survived because gamers had no real alternative. DirectX kept them locked in. Studios optimized for Windows first. Linux was treated like an afterthought. Then Valve launched the Steam Deck in February 2022. It runs Steam OS, which is built on Linux. By mid-2025, over 6 million units were sold. Millions of gamers suddenly realized something uncomfortable for Microsoft. Linux gaming works. Proton, Valve's compatibility layer, now supports over 12,400 verified Steam titles. Another 30% of games run fine but are unverified. Steam's hardware survey tells the story. Linux gaming share was 1.4% in January 2023. It climbed to 3.2% in January 2024. Then 6.8% in January 2025. By December 2025, it reached 9.3%. That is roughly 13 million gamers using Linux. That is not a rounding error. That is momentum.
Mark says the Linux program at Lenovo is very much alive. Last year was crazy/exhausting/frustrating/exciting and was a big learning curve.
Gamers started benchmarking their systems. Same PC, same graphics card. Windows 11 versus Linux. In some tests like Counter-Strike 2, Linux delivered 340 FPS compared to 285 FPS on Windows 11. That is a 19% increase. Why? Lower overhead, fewer background services, no unnecessary telemetry eating resources. Windows 11 feels heavier because it is heavier. Gamers do not tolerate lost performance. They chase every frame. And once gamers switch, they talk. They post on forums. They upload YouTube videos. They share benchmarks. The idea that Linux is not viable for gaming collapsed. Microsoft relied on that myth for years. Now it is gone. If gaming was the last fortress holding users on Windows, that fortress has a hole in it.
Particularly with regards to our internal process and the steps between certifying a platform and actually getting it out to market. COVID and the resulting components issue just added a whole extra layer of pain, but it is what it is. And Mark goes on to say, that being said,
the next force pushing people away from Windows is something Microsoft cannot block: education. YouTube tutorials explaining Linux migration have exploded. Videos titled Switching from Windows to Linux in 2025, Complete Guide, have over 11.2 million views. Another creator documenting his migration gained 8.7 million views. An honest Ubuntu versus Windows 11 comparison video passed 6.4 million views. Collectively, Linux migration tutorials have surpassed 50 million views. That means millions of regular users watch someone walk through the process step by step. They saw the installation take around 20 minutes for Ubuntu 24.04 LTS. They compared it to Windows 11 taking roughly 45 minutes. They saw idle RAM usage on Linux often 40% lower than Windows 11. They saw a clean desktop without ads or forced cloud prompts. Once people see that side by side, it becomes difficult to justify staying.
we do have a bunch of systems online in the US, and our 2021 platforms are just starting to roll out. Mark continues, saying we will have worldwide sales too. I'm not going to commit to a date because I got burnt there before by internal issues and delays.
For years, the barrier protecting Windows was fear. People believed Linux was complicated. That belief protected Microsoft. Now that fear is gone, modern distributions like Ubuntu, pop_OS, and Linux Mint are polished and simple. Pop_OS includes built-in NVIDIA driver support. Linux Mint deliberately resembles Windows 7 for users who prefer that classic layout. You install it, and it works. No driver hunting, no forced Microsoft account login. That simplicity is powerful. Now look at enterprise and government adoption. This is where the shift becomes serious. Munich migrated 29,000 employee computers to Linux years ago, switched back to Windows in 2017, then publicly regretted it. In May 2025, Munich announced a permanent return to Linux for all 29,000 systems. That decision is final. Barcelona migrated 12,000 systems. Paris deployed Linux to 28,000. Deutsche Telekom moved 60,000 workstations and publicly stated they saved $89 million compared to Windows 11 licensing and required hardware upgrades.
So here's the link. This is pretty much all of the Lenovo systems that ship with Linux. Let's go to laptops. We've got a ThinkPad T14, T15, P15, X1 Carbon, X1 Yoga, P15 Mobile Workstation, P1 Gen 3.
Why are governments doing this? Digital sovereignty. They do not want critical infrastructure dependent on a foreign corporation that controls pricing, updates, and data collection. Windows is proprietary. You cannot inspect the code. You cannot change the roadmap. With Linux, the code is open. You control your environment. In uncertain geopolitical times, that control matters. Corporations are following. Siemens is testing Linux on 50,000 workstations. Volkswagen is evaluating 30,000 systems. Manufacturing companies are piloting Linux on hundreds of machines before expanding to thousands. When heavy industry starts migrating, this is not a niche movement anymore. It is a strategic shift.
Now, the base specs for this system with Linux that ships in more than 12 weeks is Intel Core i5-10210U, 8 gigabytes of RAM, a 256 gig SSD, and 14-inch screen. Okay, remember that.
Then there is application compatibility, which used to be Windows' strongest defense. Today, most business tools are web-based. Gmail, Google Docs, Slack, Zoom, Salesforce. They run in a browser. The operating system underneath is almost irrelevant. LibreOffice handles Microsoft Office formats well enough for most companies. One company with 3,000 employees calculated Microsoft 365 subscriptions at $450,000 annually. Switching to LibreOffice saved them $1.2 million over 3 years, even accounting for training costs. Creative professionals have alternatives too. DaVinci Resolve runs natively on Linux. Blender rivals high-end 3D software. Krita replaces many Photoshop tasks. Inkscape handles vector design. For the rare Windows-only application, users run a virtual machine. Install Windows 10 inside VirtualBox for that one tool. Use Linux for everything else. That hybrid approach makes migration practical.
They sell consumer laptops with Linux on it. So it seemed like there was a disconnect between the amount of hype and goodwill that was generated and then the delivery of those promises. And during my interview with Jeremy of System 76 a couple weeks ago,
Community support is another surprise for new users. On Windows, when something breaks, you contact official support and often wait hours. On Linux, Reddit communities with hundreds of thousands of members respond in minutes. Discord servers provide live troubleshooting. Detailed documentation is community-written and constantly updated. Many new users say they learned more about their computers in 2 weeks on Linux than in 20 years on Windows. That says something about transparency. So where does this end? As of December 2025, Windows sits around 58.2% global desktop share and is declining. Linux is at 11.4% and accelerating. Projections suggest 18% by the end of 2026. If Linux crosses 15% to 18%, software developers will no longer ignore it. Hardware manufacturers will optimize for it. The network effects that once protected Windows could reverse.
Like Windows machines might. In fact, with Linux, you can debloat it so much that it just becomes text. Isn't that pretty? Of course, a lot of the reason that there's not much bloat with Linux is because, well, it's just not compatible with it.
Bill Gates built an empire on default status. Windows was everywhere because it came pre-installed. Now Lenovo is breaking that default. Gamers are leaving. Governments are migrating. Enterprises are calculating savings. Millions of users are watching tutorials and switching. Microsoft cannot compete with free software that users control. It cannot silence YouTube. It cannot block Steam Deck. It cannot force loyalty forever. Windows users are not rebelling for fun. They are making rational decisions. They are tired of ads in a paid operating system, tired of forced updates, tired of hardware mandates. Linux offers control, lower cost, performance, and respect. Once people experience that difference, they rarely return. That is what makes this moment historic. Not anger, not hype, choice. And once the default changes to choice, the power dynamic shifts permanently.